I would like to maybe introduce myself to start with. I'm Nena Stojkovic. I'm the Undersecretary General in International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. As many of you know, we are a network of 192 national societies, practically present in every country in the world, including countries facing protracted crisis, fragility, conflict. And we also are very deeply rooted and based in local communities. Our experience has been that there are many countries falling through the cracks when it comes to investments in climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. As we seek support for programs in certain countries, we can find that this can be challenging with our donors. When we go to our traditional humanitarian partners, they feel that the work on climate adaptation, resilience, DRR is not necessarily in the scope of their funding envelopes. When we go to development organizations, they are sending us back to the humanitarian teams. So we are trying to see through this panel how we can connect the dots and how we can get more funding for adaptation, but also more funding to local communities, and in particular in the most challenging countries in the world, those that are fragile and conflict affected. I just wanted to throw out one number, and I hope that my esteemed panelists can give us more data, but based on the World Disasters Report that IFRC produced, 32 of the most vulnerable countries receive less than $1 per person per year in climate adaptation funding. I also, coming from the private sector organization within the World Bank Group, wanted to mention the role of the private sector. Very often, it gets forgotten when we talk about funding, and we go always to the usual sources, whether they are humanitarian or development budgets. But if anyone has a view on the private sector and the role on the funding, it would be great to hear that. So how do we address this? This is exactly what we will talk about in today's session on Solutions Day here at the COP27. And the idea is to dig into solutions that might work, to wrestle with some thorny questions, to consider how we may need to shift from business as usual in order to close this funding gap. And this could mean new partnerships, as I already mentioned, the role of the private sector, how do we work together, stretched mandates, innovation, trying out new tools, and challenging traditional power dynamics. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, our guest speaker, Colette Benugi. She's an advocate, academic, and engineer in innovation and societal development. She's the founder of the NGO Lead Chad and has focused her research and advocacy on community development, gender issues, climate resilience, and recurring crises in the Sahel. Colette, welcome. Speaking from your experience, do you feel that there is a blind spot for fragile and conflict-affected states in terms of funding for climate adaptation? What do you see as the problem, and how would you like to see this addressed? Colette, please, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Et j'aimerais vraiment dire à tous les participants.
I'd like to thank all of you and to welcome all of the participants. Talking about the vulnerable communities and the climate change and the crisis that we have. Today we're talking about the countries, those countries who have problems, conflicts, those countries considered to be fragile countries. They represent usually the first victims of any conflict, especially the vulnerable communities, women, children, etc. And also they are fragile in terms of culture, in terms of social dimension. For example, the water resources, the natural resources, they do have a problem to get access to the most important resources they have in their own community due to the problems and conflicts and civil wars. In Chad, for example, one of the African countries where we have a lot of conflicts, this is the case, and this is the scene that we can see there. A lot of conflict between those working in pastoral activities and those working in livestock activities for water and for other resources. And that is why today we are talking about those coming for grazing activities, and the new tribes or the newcomers to work in the grazing area. They are usually armed, and they protect their small pieces of land using their arms, using their weapons against other tribes or against the farmers of the same area, or that is happening for the sake of water or for the sake of the natural resources in the area. All that is leading to have a kind of continuous immigration from north to south and from south to north in unhuman conditions of life, and they also are exposed to terrorist acts, and at the same time they also are attacked by some of the extreme events, like for example the floods or the drought in some areas, especially when we know that temperature there is high as 45 degrees centigrade. In some of those countries also the political situation is very fragile, and that affects a lot their socio-economic status. So this cycle, unfinished cycle of conflict makes those people more vulnerable. And the first among the vulnerable persons in those communities are the women and the kids. Until so far we have mobilized a lot of resources and support, financial support from different organizations through the different projects and programs we are putting in practice in this area, and also we are using the early alert and early detection systems. But in spite of all these efforts, but we still fall short in terms of having the sufficient or the enough resources to provide those communities with. We have conducted an analytic study demanded by the government of Chad, and the findings of this study, we have concluded that Chad, for example, has 5 times more support, financial support and programs than other African countries. So it is a great disaster, because in spite of the fact that they have a lot of projects and a lot of developmental efforts from the international society or from the regional society, but they still have a lot of problems. They cannot reach the required resilience. And I have one of the most important events that I witnessed in Africa in collaboration with the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, who stated that the cultivated lands in Chad have also have been deteriorated due to the conflicts and the problem. 15% out of the total land area has been removed from the cultivated land, and we, according to the statistics also of FAO, 45% of the African population might be under the poverty line by 2023, but we need to have more financial support.
Thank you very much, Colette. And thank you for talking about the unfinished cycle of conflict and reminding us of who are the most vulnerable in the community. I would like now to go to our panelists, but before I give the floor to each of them for short opening remarks, I would just like to introduce them. So Nick, welcome. Nick Bridge is the Special Representative for Climate Change for the United Kingdom. He was previously British Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and International Energy Agency, and Nick is here with us in person. I would like to next introduce Srilata Kamila, who serves as the head for climate change adaptation in the Bureau for Policy and Program Support for UNDP. She is responsible for strategic leadership and management of adaptation programming in over 100 countries and oversees UNDP's support to countries on mainstreaming adaptation into policy and planning. Srilata, welcome. She's also here in person. Now I would like to turn to our online participants who I now see, at least the two of them, on the line. And I will introduce Justin Sykes, who is an impact investment specialist with over 20 years of experience in supporting the design and deployment of private capital to reduce inequality and empower vulnerable populations. He founded Innovest Advisory in 2015. Justin, thank you for joining us remotely. Now I believe that the last person on the panel is Annemieke de Jong. Is it correct? Annemieke, I haven't met you, and I know that we had another female participant supposed to join us from the World Bank, and I don't see her here. So Annemieke is the head of Portfolio Refugee Livelihoods at the IKEA Foundation, working towards identifying pathways of self-reliance for refugees and their host communities in selected countries in East Africa. She has led IKEA's investments to support people affected by displacement, and thank you again for being us here remotely. I also want to make a point that we have a lot of participants online and that later on we may be hearing from them through the chat function. Just to check with my colleagues here, I believe that the colleague from the World Bank has not joined. Okay, great. Please let me know if she does. We're continuing. The first question to all of our panelists is to share their views on the climate adaptation funding and in particular what it means for fragile and conflict-affected countries, as we heard from Colette. And Nick, we will start with you.
Nena and everybody here and online, thank you so much for having me, Nick Bridge, and having the UK represented. It's great to be here, and it's a fantastic hub that we've got. So thank you to everybody who's making these sessions happen. Yeah, I suppose just to start, I want to come on, I think later and talk about just the array of specific programs that we have been involved in over the years and how we're developing and accelerating, because we've, as the UK in this COP, committed the tripling of our adaptation financing on the back of last year's doubling. So as we see climate impacts exponentially impacting, you have to have financial responses exponentially impacting. And we are off track as a community and a global community, dramatically off track for the scale of the events, but we are trying with those commitments this year to keep up. So I suppose I'll start just reflecting for a moment on COP26. As the presidency, we had a huge responsibility to bring adaptation properly alongside mitigation. And it's maybe easy to think now that that was already always the case, but it really wasn't until last year, and we tried very, very hard to bring adaptation and resilience right up there, to have the open conversation about loss and damage, which is now continuing, and is very challenging, but it's continuing. And so I think we did do our best to achieve that at COP, to get that consideration of adaptation and resilience and loss and damage alongside mitigation, and to make sure that the finance conversation really began to reflect the scale of the challenge. As you look at the 100 billion, which we still haven't delivered on, and then you look at one country, Bangladesh, with a $240 billion adaptation plan, an excellent plan, and you compare one country's plan to the entire global community's target. So we're beginning to see the scale of the challenge and how much we still have to do. And then the second thing, I suppose, just as a general reflection is, what is my perspective on this? I mean, I thought that at COP26 we had enough global impact to deliver a kind of extraordinary increase in political awareness. But what about this year? With Pakistan, the Horn of Africa, I was at a children's event where we looked at 3.5 million children dropping out of education in the Horn of Africa alone, 20,000 schools still closed in Pakistan, right across every part of the world. I don't need to list the hundreds of extreme weather impacts that we're now experiencing. And so just 2 or 3 years ago, for many parties, this was an abstract conversation, and very, very quickly it's accelerated into an absolute reality everywhere for everyone. And so that's why this is a perfect discussion to be having. We've talked about humanitarian responses for many years, but they're bigger than ever. 300 million people currently displaced, bigger than ever, getting bigger all the time. And we're talking about a climate response which we've only just begun to link to our development agenda. We've only just begun to link to our nature and environmental degradation. And we've got to link all of that back into every country's economic plan and economic strategy. So it's really right in the epicenter of this discussion where humanitarian, adaptation, development generally, education, health, economic planning, all of it has come crashing into the same conversation. And this is a massive challenge to deal with that intellectually and then to turn it into action on the ground, which is locally led and which is coherent and is accessible. We hear a lot about the difficulty of accessing finance, the lack of capacity to streamline it. And I remember 20 years ago, the conversations about how many well-meaning partners were in a country trying to help in totally uncoordinated ways. And if we're not careful, we'll have exactly the same problem as we try and coordinate humanitarian and climatic responses, that everybody wants to be helpful, but it has to be done in a way that a country with very limited capacity can accommodate. So maybe I'll stop there and come back with some specific examples of where we're trying to improve our response.
I thank you, Nick, really, for reminding us about the big commitments made in Glasgow and the remaining work that has to be done through the negotiations here. But also, this has been the worst year ever in terms of some of the climate-related disasters, and millions of people suffered, and thousands of people lost their lives in Pakistan and some other crises. So that's why we are here, to really possibly think of some solutions for how this will be addressed. Srilata, please, you are next for your couple of minutes remarks.
Thank you. Firstly, again, thank you so much for hosting this and convening this dialogue. I want to say it's about time, and these kinds of conversations need to happen, but it's really been an ever-pressing problem for a long time, which is about how do you look at fragility and conflict, and then what does climate action, climate finance, and really the communities the most affected, what does it mean for them? So just want to share a couple of perspectives in terms of when the climate change it aggravates the drivers of fragility and conflict, especially as I think Colette articulated to the extent I could understand in translation, especially those drivers related to natural resources, access to land, water resources, and poverty and inequalities. And those most vulnerable who are already at the stretching capacities and sort of those already facing the impact of the conflict just don't have the capacities to cope with this kind of climate change risks and impacts, extreme events, but also the variability that we see. And 70% of what are considered fragile states are in LDCs. So climate change then is also not only aggravating the drivers of fragility and conflict, it's actually exaggerating and creating more fragility and conflict when it comes to these kinds of impacts. Many other governments are already overburdened and constrained in terms of service provision, in terms of social protection in these kinds of fragile and conflict-affected states. And then when you look at communities who already have a very uncertain sense of their access to, let's say, land, again, food and water security issues, what we're looking at is going past their coping capacities in such cases. And to the extent that around 2/3 of the extreme poor that we expect by 2030 to be living in fragile conflict states, these linkages that you mentioned around the development, humanitarian, education, they become really, really crucial. And in fact, climate finance has been, adaptation finance has been inadequate, and it has been woefully inadequate when we come to fragile and conflict states. I think a study UNDP did showed that, I think, between 2014 to May last year, it showed that per year, non-fragile states, excluding SIDS, received twice the climate finance, adaptation finance, as did the fragile states. And then if you look at fragile versus extremely fragile, in this case, the non-fragile, again, excluding SIDS, received 5 times what the extremely fragile states licked. So obviously the disparity is stark. And again, to the extent that even where we talk about post-recovery, the priorities for many governments usually undermine the climate priorities, again, because they're overstretched and they're overburdened. So in this context, for UNDP, the work really is about focusing on our sort of central tenet about leaving no one behind when it comes to development. And we do look at development in various settings, and fragile and conflict being one of them. And UNDP's own portfolio, and I can talk about that a little bit later, we work we work in terms of adaptation and resilience as development action, as a means to achieving the leaving no one behind agenda. And that does mean working communities, working with local organizations. It's also about entry points around food and water security, ecosystem restoration in a way that protects the integrity of the services for the people. Thinking about interventions that can last through and beyond the conflict. And some of these are of course, the integrated food, water, land, and ecosystem nexus, but it's also things that build resilience around financial literacy, labor skills, education, health, outcomes that are often undermined by the international communities, but often these things last through a conflict. And it's important for us to think about social protection and adaptation in a lot more serious way, because again, as I just said, the attention during disasters, conflict, the displacement that this produces, so like 1 million Somalians fled last year. Since last year to now, and the number is growing in terms of not being able to face with drought. So I think for us, we have to look at, again, this nexus of humanitarian, peace building, mobility, adaptation, underlying with some of these fundamental factors around the development factors that contribute to a long-term way of sustaining through the conflict, and also using these measures in a way that sometimes help mediate and help with conflict resolution. When we talk about adaptation that looks at natural resources and how they're protected with participatory inclusive governance, it helps actually ease conflict. It helps create capacities, lives, and livelihoods that can sometimes de-escalate intercommunal tensions, for instance. So very much about local community work and decentralized work that helps those communities face a conflict and prepare them for a post-conflict world as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for linking it very nicely for us in terms of the broader scope and also the role of different partners, and including the local communities and hearing their voice on what is needed in those communities. I would like to go now to our participants online. Annemieke, can you please share with us IKEA Foundation's view and your own on this topic?
Excellent, wonderful. Yes, and thank you to the panelists so far. And I think you already mentioned, Madam, that we shouldn't forget sometimes the role of private sector and coming in from a philanthropy, also what philanthropic funding can support in this. So just to share that we're the philanthropic arm of Inca, they're the largest franchisee of IKEA stores, and we're a grant-making organization. And so under our climate and livelihood overarching strategy, we're able to fund programs and strategies behind mitigation and adaptation strategies. And it comes from a place where we very much believe that obviously you can invest in both those streams at the same time to really deliver on needs and on change. And just to, again, emphasize as well that we think very much that philanthropy has a very important role to play. Just a few thoughts under the planet pillar that we fund, or our climate pillar. We seek to find fewer but larger investments that really help to reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible in some of the highest emitting industries. Some of the collaborations that we are funding under there were, for instance, also announced at previous COPs, for instance, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, and that's an example where our philanthropic funding is a very efficient way of being supportive. And it also is next to ensuring that key countries and companies also have in place plans to deliver against the 1.5 degree target, as well as strategies that actually support behavioral change in people where we think that's most efficient. And that's where I think under that strategy, we focus primarily on higher emitting countries, but also are investing in strategies that are in more fragile settings as well. Then under our sort of livelihood or people strategies, historically we've been investing in more fragile and conflict settings already. So a lot of the elements that our colleagues have spoken about, education and protection, are programs that we have been funding for the last decade or so. And under our current strategy, it is very much about investing in renewable energy for productive use. We're looking at regenerative agriculture, putting the models and data behind that, really making sure we can grow, but within the resources that are there. It's also about understanding what the future of work looks like, so the green employment and entrepreneurship opportunities within that too. And then coming at it from my team and my personal perspective, of course, through our refugee programmatic ambitions, making sure that people already affected by forced displacement are very much not left behind, and I'm part of those strategies and solutions. So I think what philanthropy can bring here as well is already taking this longer term lens. We're able to do these multi-year investments because we know it takes time as well. And we just heard from our other panelists as well, the complexity of things to think about. And it's also very much through our funding that we aim to understand what's working best. So it is about funding research and evaluation activities when the program allows us. It's obviously not always possible, but through that, we're really able to understand what are the kinds of things that work really well in that particular context so that we can build these pathways to scale and reach many more people. What we then also aim to do within all of that is applying lenses of business principle thinking. It is a lot about innovation and learning, not just for the sake of that, but again, really trying to see then what those pathways for scale look like. So often that actually, next to those emission reduction and climate grounds, also translates into those kinds of livelihood opportunities that will also increase incomes and business opportunities, and obviously then to larger well-being of families and for families to be more resilient, but doing that within the bounds of the natural environment of the program. And again, really helping to create that resilience that's needed. And that's the way that we as a foundation, private sector philanthropy, can support mitigation, adaptation for fragile settings through both those ways. I would say though, and that's what the founder of IKEA used to say, for comfort, a lot remains to be done. So we absolutely recognize this, but it is also a way for us to engage and making sure that our philanthropic funding streams are being as resourceful and as efficient as possible within that.
Thank you very much for bringing IKEA Foundation's perspective and your own. And Justin, I would like to go now to you. Same question, what can be done?
Thanks, Nina. And I think hopefully I can bring in some of that private sector perspective to the conversation today. We at Innovest are a specialist impact advisor to the private markets fund industry. We're working now with 15 fund managers with around 2 billion under management for impact investments. And these are managers investing through various diverse strategies and various geographies to achieve commercial returns alongside specific climate, environmental, or social impact. A significant portion of that capital is invested into emerging markets. And of that investment into emerging markets, I'd say probably about 10% of that 2 billion, so almost 200 million, is actually going into fragile and conflict affected contexts. So I think what we're seeing is there is money, private capital as well from fund managers, but also other forms of capital in terms of diaspora funding flowing back into fragile contexts. And I think what we're seeing is how that capital can be deployed in a way that is not only addressing underlying development challenges around job creation, local economic development, financial inclusion, but we then also look to align that capital with the climate crisis and broader environmental challenges. So we look at how do we build investment strategies that create co-benefits from the get-go, and that are climate smart investment strategies that are done in a way that really achieve this broad set of climate, social, and environmental impact through their investment strategies. I think where we're seeing in our work also is that a key challenge to move more capital, climate smart capital, into fragile contexts is perception risk. That there is a significant risk for investors to go into those markets. I call it perception risk because quite often that risk is perceived rather than actual, because there is money flowing in, as I said, from diaspora, from canny private investors. And it's how do we attract unconventional capital that may not have come into those markets to do so. And we're seeing really that's where blended finance instruments that and de-risk investments into challenging contexts become extremely important. That blending, however, should not be sacrificing what should be an underlying commercially viable market model, but it's really there to address perception risk that investors may have coming into these markets. So that's what we're seeing, and I think also I'd add to some of the commentary from earlier speakers about the kind of the nexus of challenges that we see right now around climate and conflict. Absolutely, I'd agree that the climate crisis is both a driver and accelerant of conflict, but I think it's only more challenging today in the current context, the macroeconomic context, where we're looking at inflationary pressures, we're looking at strengthening of the dollar and the weakening of local currency, creating existing debt obligations even more challenging, and then overlaying food security crises on top of that. So it's multiple compounded issues that we're facing right now that make the need for this capital flowing into some of the toughest markets even more critical. And later on in the conversation, I can give you some very practical examples of where we're working with fund managers to deploy capital into these contexts. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Justin. My second question to all of you was meant to be on the barriers to do more of the investments and support in fragile and conflict-affected states, and you already brought up the level of risk that private sector has to endure when they're coming in and how possibly that could be mitigated. I believe that our colleague from the World Bank joined us, Aram Metol, Senior Adaptation and Resilience Specialist in the Climate Change Group of the World Bank Group. Aram, welcome. I know that the World Bank is one of the largest financiers of climate adaptation in the world. I just heard in a previous discussion that there is around 36 billion every year going into this space. And we wanted to hear your perspective on what is the World Bank doing or what the MDBs should be doing to get the more funding into fragile and conflict-affected countries for climate adaptation. Arame, please.
Great. Can you hear me? Let me just do a second.
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Glad the technology is collaborating. I haven't had much luck with it. So really happy to be joining all of you, to see familiar faces. Hello to Sri Lanka and indeed your colleagues, and to meet new friends on this agenda. Listen, I was very excited to accept this invitation because the theme is one very dear to my heart. I think as we approach the eye of the cyclone, as climate scientists have been warning for over the past 20 years, we often tend to leave the most vulnerable behind. And I think one emerging agenda item that many of us are now putting our weight behind is this issue of ensuring that climate finance actually goes to those that need it the most. And where that is most needed is indeed in FCV, fragile conflict settings, where we see a conflagration of risk, development and poverty risks associated now with explosive, increasing risks from climate impacts, droughts, cyclones, flooding, and you name it. So keeping those most vulnerable at the center of what we do, I think is ever so more important as we advance in scaling up climate finance. I do see two important axes of work as all of us, including MDBs, but also humanitarian agencies, and more the private sector that I'm really delighted to see on this panel. I think as we all look ahead as how we do better, the two questions I have in mind, the two axes of impact I have in mind is first, really, how do we ensure that we can reach those areas with the climate finance that is required? I think we see it across the board. ODI had a really good paper released earlier this year on the statistics shared earlier, I think, on this panel on how just the propensity of financing need and gap going to these areas. In Burundi, where I'm calling from today, what we see is that forced displacements were caused 100%, driven 100% by climate-related disasters, which is huge. So the in-migration issue is becoming ever more serious. So the question is, how do we ensure that we can protect those most at risk? How do we ensure the financing that we deploy, both across the development finance and humanitarian assistance axis, really does reach those that need this financing, mostly in a setting where capacity is extremely low. So it's governments that don't necessarily have government entities devoted to capturing green climate finance or even coming to develop projects that would get this financing in place. So how do we ensure that we get to them? And I think that's a dedicated priority that needs to be embedded within all that we do, NDBs, UN agencies, and so forth, to ensure that we are actually targeting, as we deploy country climate finance, those areas that necessarily wouldn't be asking for such finance, and ensuring most of all that there's development effectiveness in reaching those that need this support the most. In this agenda now, quite practically, analytics are often the biggest barrier. It's just really hard to know the localization of these impacts at the local level. Where are climate impacts, floods, droughts hitting the most? And most importantly, how do we prioritize those up in the national dialogue so that governments can actually get the funding they need to get to those places most effective? So I think that's an ongoing challenge. I'm really enthused to see the promising initiatives, including the one led by ICRC. I see Anaïs on the line. So I've been working with them consistently to ensure that there's just more evidence being built, more advocacy across the board to say it's really important that we channel finance, adaptation finance to these places that otherwise wouldn't be receiving it. And most importantly, that we work together in partnership. And I see a lot of value in doing that across MDBs, across UN partnerships, across the private sector, to really take a coalition of the willing to ensure that that finance first gets deployed, second doesn't get stuck, and third reaches those places that otherwise would be extremely difficult to reach. Again, giving a real country example, I'm reporting from Burundi. In the police landscapes of Burundi, we're trying to scale up financing to reach the women and youth and extremely vulnerable communities here that are being hit by not only post-conflict social cohesion challenges, but also mounting landslides that are destroying farms and livelihoods. So what we try to do here quite concretely is to ensure that we use climate finance, not just to safeguard and protect, but also as an opportunity to do development better. And I think Sri Lanka, when I came in, I was hearing you mentioning something like that. I think it's really important to recall that these are places that are overall underinvested in, and ensuring that the new finance that's coming in is an opportunity to actually mend some of the old wounds from past conflicts and really build social cohesion through climate adaptation is a huge opportunity. And I hope we can document more of that as we do more of this work on the ground across the spectrum. And it's really confirming what we've always said in adaptation, that it's not only a chance to protect and to adapt, but also an opportunity to do development better, knowing that climate and development are just intrinsically linked. I'll stop there. I do have a lot more to say on private sector. As you know, we released a report last year on enabling private investment, but I know our colleagues from IKEA and Invest have already covered some ground there. So I'll leave it as that and happy to come in later. Thanks again for having me on the panel.
Thank you very much, Arame. I wanted to come back to the room here and maybe explore this question on the barriers. And both Nick and Srilata mentioned that they can share with us some of the examples where actually things are working or have worked. So Nick, over to you. And I may not get to all the panelists for the second round, but let me start with Nick here.
I'll try to be brief so you can bring as many people in. I suppose in just illustrating some of the action that we have in place, it tells a certain story, and then it also shows the gaps. I wanted to mention a few programs. I guess it falls into preemptive action, looking at disaster risk and early warning systems. We've got the CRUISE, the climate, climate risk, early warning systems work. We've got a whole set of partnerships we're supporting, including through some of the partners here, on disaster risk insurance. So, of course, it's only part of the problem, but it's ensuring that when something does happen that you know is coming, that you have in place, you've pooled your risk. There is a return there for insurers and for investors, and that's a program that's we've put 120 million pounds into, and it's now moved from Caribbean across to Africa. And I helped launch just yesterday the latest version of it, which was the first time we've specifically orientated the disaster insurance towards children. So it's not that the whole community doesn't benefit, but you base the scale and the type of your response on the children in the community, and I think that's also an interesting new development. There's the whole START network with the World Food Programme, with drought insurance, again, where we've worked intensively in Africa, especially in Somalia and Zimbabwe. The Sahel shock response programme is now quite extensive across Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania. Obviously the Red Cross Disaster Response Emergency Fund that you do, and then also the UN Central emergency response. So I'm describing just like the maybe 10 or 12 active combinations of looking at the early warning and the way that we can now look with our meteorology 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, and we see these things coming. We combine that with insurance products that are in very vulnerable places. They need a government backing so that insurers can come in and say, okay, this is backed up by partners in government, so the money is getting, because one of the big things I mentioned at the beginning was access to finance. So these disaster insurance premiums are being paid out within 14 days, nearly $250 million. Obviously, though, from your amazing statistic at the beginning, it's still not getting to the most needy places, which is a very profound part of this conversation. And then I suppose I just want to finish on the wider point I started on at the beginning around the adaptation plans within the nationally determined contributions, and just how important it is to keep reinforcing that net zero plans and national determined plans are not what a country is doing to cut their emissions. Primarily, they're about what a country assesses to be its forward look, its needs, its investment needs, its capacity, so that there is a very clear, locally led plan that supporters can come in and support. So over all of this is actually a very recent agenda to make sure every country has a very clear, and is supported to do so if it needs support, to have a very clear adaptation and resilience plan. And obviously that needs to be as integrated as possible into all the existing programs. So, as a development ministry, we have been doing some things for much longer. Girls' education and health programs and sustainable livelihoods programs, and we're having to overlay the reality out there of the climate accelerated impacts onto existing work so that it's a holistic, singular coherent economic development plan in every place. But I mean, I conclude with great humility around the numbers that you started with, that we're not really tackling the issue of when a country's in conflict or deeply insecure or deeply fragile, deeply destabilized, that money's not getting into those places. And I think we take that away as a clear learning.
Thank you for recognizing that, Nick, and also thank you for sharing some of these programs and initiatives. Some of them are really very interesting, and we should try to think about how to take them to scale. I also wanted to acknowledge the role of the UK government in supporting blended finance instruments. They have been one of the leading governments who recognized that blending can actually stretch the ODA, which is very, very limited, and we can go much further with that. And I think Justin talked about de-risking and as a one way to bring more private sector into some of the most difficult contexts. I would take a bit of a pause here just to see whether we have any questions in the room or on the line, and we'll try to get to other panelists as well. A question, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Robha Murha. I am Africa Youth Pastoralist Initiative member. I come from Ethiopia. So as we were talking about, no one left behind, in the climate justice, does we include the pastoralists because we are in the conflict areas? Previously within 10 years or 20 years we have having flood, but nowadays it's changing, and every year we face flood and drought. So what kinds of adaptation plan and strategies are you developing on the negotiation stage? And while I was in these different pavilions, I have never seen discussions related to pastoralism, like pastoralism and rangeland restoration, and how pastoralism is, to be having a sustainable livestock agri-food system in Africa or other countries as a world. So why should they have been, marginalized this much, and we are not having these kinds of discussion in COP27? So I hope you are from different, UN agencies and countries, developed countries. So in the next COP, we, ask you to have those kinds of indigenous peoples, and our voice should be heard in these kinds of conferences too. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us also of the role of indigenous communities and people. And your question was about pastoralism, and does that also kind of get considered into some of the climate adaptation work that our respective panelists are witnessing? Is anyone on the panel prepared to answer to that question? Okay, please.
Thank you. No, absolutely. I think we typically look at the agro-pastoral systems as, depending on the context, as one of the units when we look at around the land and the forestry management to looking at patterns of migration, for instance. So you're absolutely right. So as an example, when we're talking about fragility and conflict context, there's work we're doing in Sudan, specifically with pastoralists, especially along the migration pathways north Darfur, to really look at embedding adaptation from the perspective of diversity of livelihoods, protecting their livelihoods, but also building some of this literacy around understanding climate and understanding disasters and how do you cope with it. And with a specific focus on women and children who often are the carrying capacity in some ways of even through these kinds of conflicts. So it's an absolute resounding yes that we very much look at agro-pastoral systems wherever they either coexist or often where they coexist together. So fantastic question, and I agree. In these places, when we talk about indigenous people, ethnic minorities, their voices have to be brought in also during the design of the adaptation interventions, because the holders of the indigenous knowledge and the patterns that you observe become critical in creating something that can be locally led and sustained, again, as I said, through the conflict, but beyond it as well.
Sorry to speak again, but just a quick reference to the Glasgow Pact. The Glasgow Climate Pact made very big new strides building on Paris, on indigenous peoples, on land rights, on the voice of youth and the voice of children in terms of actively involving them now in the negotiations going forward. So it's not enough, but it was a very big step forward to recognize also, subnational actors, not just at the nation state, but representing all communities, and then non-state actors as well. So thank you for the point. I take it.
Thank you both for responding to this question. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Yes, one more.
Hello, and thank you all for your comments. My name is Nyawera, and I work as an ESG consultant, helping private investment companies with doing ESG analysis for investments in sub-Saharan Africa. My question relates to climate smart capital, and something that Justin, I think, had touched on. I think in the conversations that I have sometimes with the private sector, there seems to be a misconception that, there is no return with climate investments, or, it's too much work. There has to be measurement as well to make sure. There's so much scrutiny right now on greenwashing anyway, and all these issues going around about investing in climate projects. And so my question is, what can be done to kind of accelerate private sector investment, especially from smaller investors which don't really have the teams and the capacity to make sure that measurement and impact and the detail required around that is present? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great and very specific question. Justin, would you like to respond to this?
Sure, happy to. Great question. Yeah, I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is finding fund managers that have expertise and knowledge in terms of subject matter and the geography, and have a real purpose-driven mandate to deploy capital. And they exist, and they're growing quickly in number. And I think this old story of is there always going to be a trade-off between financial returns and climate or social impact has gone away. I think there are a very large number of examples now where you can demonstrate that you can achieve financial returns and achieve impact. That's not to say that in a fragile market context that actually that is achievable, because I think some parts of the world, because of their very nature, the fragility of those markets, that ability to achieve a commercial return and impact is challenging. And again, it comes down to the nature of the intervention and the manager, and them being transparent to the market around what is feasible. I think the best thing is actually to give a very practical opportunity. We're working now really closely with managers to try and design interventions that bake in co-benefits, that bake in a just transition approach to how the funds are designed, so that social development impact and climate mitigation and adaptation can be achieved practically. A really good example that brings us all together is our work with the Dutch fund manager, Cordaid Investment Management, that have launched a West Africa Bright Future Fund. And basically this fund is contributing to climate mitigation and adaptation whilst supporting sustainability in 4 fragile West African countries through equitable job creation and supporting local economic development. They're investing into pro-poor businesses that prioritize hiring vulnerable women and youth across climate smart sectors, including off-grid solar, agriculture, waste collection, and water and sanitation. And basically, climate is a key part of the theory of change of the fund. Climate metrics have been developed, and then a climate lens is applied to all screening and due diligence of all the underlying investments. So it's a very considered, highly tailored approach. And I think to the earlier conversation, people may say, well, that's wonderful, but surely this is super high risk, it must be low returns. They are very clear that they cannot make commercial returns on this fund. It's a sub-commercial return, but there is a market out there for that, from foundations, from family offices, from impact first investment funds. So there is a market. And then the other element is around de-risking, that this fund has a very well constructed blended finance structure that has both a first loss and a guarantee facility. And when these two elements combined are brought into play, it changes the risk and return profile for private investors to come to the table. And they would have, perhaps their accountant may have looked at the deal and said, love it, but it's philanthropy and I cannot invest. But now they can come back and they actually, with this risk protection in place, it does allow me to invest into this project. So just wanted to give you a sense of the art of the possible.
Thank you very much, Justin. So in a way, if I understood you well, it is possible and such structures exist, but they're still not well established and well received because of this perceived risk, and also confusion a little bit on who will take what risk. I would like to start slowly getting to the closing, and we'll give each panelist just 1 minute for one remark on what do you think we should be doing between now and COP28 if we want to see a bit of a different picture than what we painted at the early part of this conversation. But maybe a reminder to all of us, we're talking about communities in some of the most challenging countries in the world. Even for the less challenging countries and communities, we know that only 10% of global climate finance is going into adaptation, and then a fraction of this really goes to where it is most needed. From their perspective, they don't care whether we are a humanitarian organization, development organization, private sector, local, global, they or their own government, they expect support, and we have to come together as partners and find some of the ways and mechanisms to channel more funding to those most vulnerable, most marginalized communities in the world. And with that thought, I now want to make another full round, but 1 minute maximum, please, each panelist. Annemike, I will start with you, and then we'll finish with colleagues here in the room. Please go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, no, I think just to emphasize from a philanthropic, strategic philanthropy perspective, I think a lot of what Justin was saying is very resonant, right? There is an opportunity to help think through strategies to de-risk and to actually get philanthropy to find its place in all the different funding streams for things that might be more difficult to fund or might be just less easy to explain to your decision maker or your constituents, right? So I'm thinking particularly around some of the models also that Justin was talking about, but also the evidence and learning agenda, right? I mean, we have not that much time. Equally though, we want to make sure that what we're scaling are the right things to scale. So I think there's a lot in what Justin was saying around that perceived risk. I do see an opportunity to be a bit more braver and a bit more bold when it comes to finding each other, lighting up the kinds of financial streams in a way that it makes sense for each and the risk levels are accordingly so. And I think that's what hopefully we can also from our perspective show more and more with some of our mitigation and adaptation strategies, where we are internally making sure we've got our house in order, obviously, but that has an external effect as well, and where we're finding our funding make a lot of efficiencies and a lot of effectiveness coming through, and hopefully we can show a lot more of that as well for the next COP.
Thank you very much. Justin, any last words from you in addition to what you said?
No, I think I had enough time to speak, but I think reiterate your point, Nina, about there are good practice models out there. How do we scale them? And I think that really is about more visibility, more sharing, opportunities for peer networking, and bringing more partners into a room to try and determine what opportunities there are for cooperation and for replication. So that would be my call is how do we get knowledge out there so that we can scale move from incremental to exponential.
Thank you very much. Arame, any last thought on your side? What can we do more between now and COP28 and
I
beyond?
think it's a great question. What I would like to see by next year, two things. First, an expansion of the amount of climate finance going into adaptation. Wishful thinking, but I think we are on the right axis, at least with this group. So we are at what, 7% now as per CPI numbers. So I hope by next year we will at least have reached the 10%, Nina, you've mentioned, an increasing share of that from private sources. It's really enthusing to see more private actors coming to these COPs. So I think we're on the right track there. If we can do what we did for mitigation and really create value chains, returns on investments and actual bankable projects on adaptation that private investors can put their money to, I think that's a big win.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to give the mic to the other side of the room, but I just wanted to say that we need you, all three of you, and your respective organizations and the likes. We need philanthropy here, we need private sector, and we need MDBs. We need somehow to connect those sources with the humanitarian and ODA to get this implemented. So with that, Srilata, and then Nick.
Okay.
Thank you. No, great. 3 points. I think the first one came up from all the discussions we were just having. I think for us, collectively, it's important to address the information asymmetries that exist, both from the perspective of communities, understanding the climate fragility and many of the intersection of various crises, market intelligence, for financial intermediaries to understand the risk better so that they can better invest, as well as for communities to understand it better to adopt. So things around climate information, early warning systems, along with other information, I think that's going to be important for the finance to flow. The second, I think it's about community empowerment, local actors, indigenous youth, and engaged in this. Again, because there are models that work. There's a Jeff-funded challenge window that's now operational in the fragile conflict context. And we're working with local NGOs, for example, in Sudan, in DRC, under what we established as an innovation marketplace for adaptation with various partners, including Global Resilience Partnership. 600 men and women and indigenous are being supported on looking at caterpillar trees and how you can look at enterprise food security and resilience together. In Timor-Leste, for example, in Myanmar, I'll actually take that example of solar-based enterprises. Last point, again, in terms of the priority is the coordination among us as actors, finally. Humanitarian, peace-building, development, climate nexus, and that would be key for us to take it to COP. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I said earlier that these problems have been building for many, many years, but they've really hit the headlines, and the adaptation has only just got the kind of level of attention that it needs. And so we've got to get stories out there now as money starts to flow, stories to show the difference it's making, to stop moving from inputs into outputs and how we are making communities resilient. It's really hard. Somebody said before, it's really easy to say, well, we shut down this power station, so we've had a big mitigation win. Much harder to show the benefits of an adaptation or a resilience action. We have to get better at telling those stories. And I think the second thing for the industrialized world is that they've got to be mainstreaming this into leaders, the top of leaders' minds, as the massive, unmanaged, unquantified risk to their security and their prosperity. And this has got to stop being a marginal issue alongside other things in the inbox, and it's got to really affect the way they think about their whole international engagement, their development plans. This is mainstreamed into our understanding of what the main problems in the world are. And so we get it out, not just in the COP, but it's in every UN forum, it's in all the G20, G7, and it's more mainstreamed. Thank you.
Very much, absolutely, fully agreed. And now I would like to pass it on to Colette for her final 1 minute or less so remarks.
Thank you very much. Concluding with the question that I think that the most important that each country, each fragile country has its own challenging.
avoir des interventions plus sur mesure.
And they have to develop their measures to face the problem. One of the problems, for example, the literacy, the financial literacy, the climatical literacy. The financial resources and the funding is one of the major problems. So we have to arrange our priorities in those countries, and how also to teach people how to prioritize their own financial resources, especially in areas where we have armed conflicts or where we have a deep climate change impact. So all the countries should know how to manage that and how to solve the problem. The governance also is one of the most important issues that we have to consider, and the coming years governance is badly needed. And I think the next CAP 28 CAP should consider talking about the stability of other countries, because without stability we cannot have any kind of development. In countries where we have always fragile situation, where we have armed conflicts, where we have civil wars, lack of stability is a big barrier that hinders all our efforts towards development. We have learned a lot of lessons in my country, as Mr. Nick mentioned earlier, but we still have a lot of challenges ahead.
Thank you very much, Colette.
Merci beaucoup.
And thank you to
very
all
much.
the panelists for the great discussion. Thank you to those who asked questions, those who listened to us. I just wanted to say something on this Solutions Day. We had representatives here of the government, of the multilateral development organizations, of local NGOs, the largest humanitarian network in the world, the private sector, large philanthropic organization, and the private sector. And I think if we cannot solve it, if we cannot get more funds to flow to where they are needed most, I don't think that anyone else can. So we do have a path, Nick, as you said. It's not about COPs, it's about reiterating the same messages, but also keep finding those mechanisms that could bring some of our financial instruments together and showcase them, and then take them to scale. That's our task between now and the next COP and beyond. And thank you, colleagues, again for such a lively discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you.